Welcome to the Forgotten Narrator. There is a stillness in the air before a storm, a pregnant silence that promises not thunder but rot. That is the legacy of the Death Guard, the warriors who brought pestilence not as a weapon but as a gospel. They were not born monsters. They were made so by the long shadow of their own convictions, the arrogance of their master, and the tender patience of a God who does not demand obedience, but simply waits. Of all the traitor legions, it is the Death Guard who embody the slow, irreversible fall, the quiet kind of doom that seeps into the soul like damp into stone. They are not the loudest servants of chaos. There is no manic laughter in their ranks, no flamboyant heresy. Only silence, rust, and the eternal wheeze of lungs too full of filth to scream. The Death Guard do not kill for glory or pleasure. They kill because they are death, walking. And long before they fell to Nurgle, they were already something else. Something that looked too much like what they would become. The 14 Legion was not seduced. It was recognized. The Plague God did not twist them. He merely gave them form. Before they bore the name Death Guard, before they marched under the banner of decay, they were the Dusk Raiders, grim, relentless warriors drawn from the vaults of old Earth. In those early days of the Legiones Astartes, this 14th Legion was defined by endurance and pragmatism. Their armor was painted a dusty gray, stained crimson along one arm and shoulder, not for decoration, but as a mark of their unrelenting advance, like dusk falling across the land before night devoured it whole. They were methodical, favoring direct engagements, brutal sieges, and the slow grind of attritional warfare. There was no flash to their fighting, no pride in elegance. Just results, always at the cost of blood. The Dusk Raiders were shaped by the toxic environment of Terra's Pan-Pacific region, a place still reeling from old night. The recruits were drawn from war-torn techno-barbarian tribes, already accustomed to filth, disease, and suffering. These proto-Marines learned early that victory was not about speed or spectacle. It was about survival. Their bodies, enhanced by Astartes augmentation, still bore the mindset of soldiers who understood that sometimes the only way forward was through mud, through bile, through whatever ruin stood in the way. And if the path was not clear, they would simply make it with bolter fire and sheer force of will. Even among the early legions, the Dusk Raiders were regarded with a mixture of respect and unease. Other legions saw in them a certain lack of grandeur, a purity of purpose that made them dangerous. They didn't fight for the Emperor's dream of unity. Not really. They fought because war was the only thing that made sense. Their loyalty was practical, their methods brutal, and their commanders enforced a culture of grit above all else. When faced with alien horrors or rebellious warlords, they didn't recoil or hesitate. They pushed forward, immune to fear, numb to pain. There was a quiet ritual to their war-making. They would arrive on a world in the twilight hours, the crimson dusk reflecting off their armor like drying blood. Without ceremony, they would strike, targeting infrastructure, key strongholds, supply lines. Cities would fall not in hours, but in days of constant pressure. The enemy would not be outmaneuvered. They would be exhausted, broken under the weight of relentless combat. And then, only then, would the Dusk Raiders allow themselves the final blow. It was war as erosion, victory through inevitability. But beneath that method was something else, something unspoken. A bitterness, a rejection of grandeur and faith. Where other legions sang praises to the Emperor, the Dusk Raiders were cold. Loyal, yes, but never zealous. They saw no divinity in their cause, only duty. They were the kind of soldiers who did not need inspiration because they had already accepted death as part of the job. This emotional detachment, this armor of cynicism, was not a flaw. It was their strength. But it also made them vulnerable, not to seduction, but to despair, to stagnation, and eventually to something far worse. When the Emperor found Mortarion and gave him command of the 14th Legion, it was not a joyous reunion of kindred spirits. It was a fusion of fatalisms. The Gene Sons and their Gene Father were already cut from the same cloth, both forged in filth, both hardened suffering, both skeptical of promises. The Dusk Raiders didn't change when Mortarion took over. They simply became more like themselves. The transition was seamless, almost eerie. It was as if they had always been waiting for a figure like Mortarion to give shape to their quiet nihilism. This early identity of the Legion, This life in the shadows of dusk would never truly leave them. Even when they were renamed the Death Guard, even after the taint of Nurgle festered in their veins, the core remained. These were never warriors who feared death. They were its patient students, and in that waiting, in that silence, something ancient heard them. Something that understood the value of endurance. Something that saw not rot, but resilience. In many ways, the Dusk Raiders were already infected before the warp storm. Not by disease, but by a way of thinking. That suffering was truth, that decay was honest, that purity was a lie. And in that bleak philosophy, the seeds of their future corruption were already taking root. It was only a matter of time before the dusk gave way to night. Mortarian's story doesn't begin as a conqueror or a warrior. It begins as a prisoner. On the nightmare world of Barbarous, a place shrouded in toxic mists and ruled by necromantic tyrants, the infant Primarch fell from the stars, not into salvation, but into despair. Raised by a creature he would later call the Overseer, Mortarian's first memories were of pain and gasping breath, struggling to survive in an atmosphere that would have killed any mortal. But Mortarian was not mortal. He was built to endure. And endure he did, through bile-choked air, under a sky that never cleared, and beneath the cruel tutelage of a warlord who saw in him both a weapon and a son. The people of Barbarous lived in constant fear, huddled in the poisonous valleys, while the mountain strongholds above were home to the monstrous rulers, corpse-masked psychers who harvested flesh and souls alike. Mortarian grew among them, taller and stronger than any of their kind, yet always aware that he was different. There was something wrong with this world, and he could feel it in his bones. But what shaped him was not merely the abuse he suffered at the hands of his adoptive father. It was the distant sight of something beyond the poison, humanity. At the edge of the toxicity there were settlements, places where people breathed clean air, where the sky was visible, where light touched the ground. Mortarian watched them from the high places, from behind a mask that filtered death. And in that watching something stirred. Envy, yes, but also purpose. Those people, fragile, doomed, were free. And he, the strongest being on the planet, was not. That paradox defined Mortarian. Strength without freedom, power without choice. So he turned against his master, slowly, quietly, gathering tools, knowledge, and eventually followers. He descended into the valleys, took in the humans who had never known anything but fear, and taught them to fight back. His crusade was one of agony. Every step into the upper altitudes was pain. But pain became a teacher. It taught him the cost of victory. It made him into something more than a rebel. It made him into a symbol. He killed many of the other necromancers, one by one, fortress by fortress, always pushing higher until only his adopted father remained. The final mountain, the final breath. But Mortarian could not go all the way. The air became too thick, even for him. His lungs, those miracle organs, faltered. He dropped to his knees in the smog, suffocating in the shadow of the man he hated most. And the Emperor arrived. It was not triumph, it was not salvation, it was theft. The Emperor, radiant and clean, descended in glory and slew the Overseer in a flash of psychic power. Mortarian was saved, but not by his own hand. The kill that should have been his was taken. The final breath denied. From that moment, something inside Mortarian broke. He bent the knee, yes, accepted command of the 14 Legion and took them into the Great Crusade. But his loyalty was a bitter one. He saw the Emperor not as a father, but as another ruler with too much power and not enough honesty. A psyker who claimed to hate sorcery. A god who claimed not to be one. Mortarian believed in strength earned through pain, not gifted through fate or born of magic. And so the tension grew, not just between him and the Emperor, but between him and himself. When Mortarian met his sons, the Dusk Raiders, it was like seeing echoes of his own soul. Men who fought without illusions, who bled for victories that others would claim. He shaped them, refined them, turned their grim pragmatism into an iron doctrine. The Legion became the Death Guard, not because they sought death, but because they accepted it. They were unyielding, immune to false hope, trained to survive anything. But Mortarian's hatred of the warp, of psychers, of the Emperor's contradictions, festered like an open wound. He viewed the Imperium not as a paradise, but a lie wrapped in gold. And in time, that wound would invite infection. It would be Horus who found the crack and Nurgle who filled it. The tragedy of Mortarion is that he was never weak. He was strong enough to survive a world designed to kill him, strong enough to challenge gods, but that strength was built on a foundation of bitterness. He never healed, he never forgave. And so when the promise of true power came, power without hypocrisy, power that asked nothing but surrender, he did not see it as betrayal. He saw it as release. Mortarion did not fall to Nurgle out of greed or lust. He fell because he was tired of breathing poison, tired of serving liars, tired of watching others win the glory while he bled in the dark. Nurgle offered him peace, not clean, not beautiful, but peace nonetheless. An end to the struggle, a place where suffering was not punishment but the natural state of all things. And Mortarion, son of Barbarous, child of Rot, finally exhaled. In the days before their fall, when the Death Guard still bore the banner of the Imperium, there was a purity to their warcraft, not in aesthetics or nobility, but in purpose. They were the legion that walked through fire and did not burn. Their strength was not in speed, not in sorcery, not in armored grandeur. It was in attrition, in patience, in the sheer immovable bulk of resolve. They advanced not as a storm, but as a tide, slow and crushing. Entire worlds were worn down by their advance, not shattered in a single strike. Their victories were inevitable because they refused to die. They fought in armor that was plain and unadorned, thick and heavy like the hide of some ancient beast. Where other legions took pride in elaborate heraldry or sacred scripts etched into ceramite, the Death Guard wore their warplate like a second skin, scored, battle-worn, functional. Their bolters were modified for endurance. Their tactics eschewed complicated maneuvers in favor of direct confrontation. If they could walk through enemy fire and reach the walls, the battle was already over. Their favored combat environment was the worst one. Radiated wastes, plague-infested hives, chemical swamps, these were the killing grounds where the Death Guard thrived. While other legions faltered in the face of filth, the 14 embraced it. Their constitution was legendary. Their resistance to poison and contagion was second only to their relentless discipline. Even before Nurgle touched them, they were seen as unnatural in their tolerance for suffering. They did not flinch. They did not panic. They endured, always. But beneath this exterior of brute persistence, something darker simmered. There was pride in their ability to suffer, an identity built around being the ones who could take it, no matter what it was. And that pride slowly curdled into resentment. They saw the other legions, resplendent ultramarines, angelic blood angels, the elite custodians, and felt the weight of inequity. While others flew, the Death Guard marched. While others inspired, they endured. They began to believe that their suffering was not just a function of war, but a sentence, a punishment, and that the Imperium, so golden, so arrogant, had no idea what it cost to win its battles. Mortarion fed this sentiment. He drilled into his sons the belief that pain was truth, that purity was weakness, that only through hardship could a warrior be truly free. The Emperor, he would say, offered illusion, a promise of peace that would never come. The only honest thing was war. And in war, there was no place for decadence or delusion. This belief did not create traitors overnight, but it planted the idea that loyalty was conditional, that maybe, just maybe, the Imperium was not worthy of the cost. During the Great Crusade, this manifested not in disobedience, but in distance. The Death Guard did their duty, but they did not bask in glory. They were the Emperor's blunt instrument, used when subtlety failed. And over time, they grew to see themselves not as protectors of humanity, but as its shield against failure. The more they suffered, the more they came to believe they were the only ones willing to pay the true price of unity. This was not a legion easily swayed by chaos. In fact, their hatred for psychers and warp corruption was well known. They saw the sorcerous practices of the Thousand Sons with disgust. They mistrusted even their own librarians. Mortarion himself despised the warp. He believed in strength through the flesh, not through forbidden arts. But therein lay the irony. The more he denied the warp, the more it noticed him. The more he resisted, the more tempting his legion became. Their resilience was legendary, but it was also what made them vulnerable, because they didn't break under pressure. They simply hardened and hardened until they could no longer bend. They were not the kind to cry out for salvation. They would rather die on their feet than ask for help. And in that stubborn silence, Nurgle whispered. He did not seduce with promises of glory or dominion. He came with patience, with empathy of a twisted sort. He offered the end of pain not through healing, but through acceptance. If the Death Guard could endure anything, why not disease? If they had already embraced decay, why not make it divine? Their identity as unbreakable soldiers became their downfall. Because when the real war came, when the warp storm trapped them, when the Emperor's lies seemed proven, when Mortarion stood silent at the edge of damnation, they did not resist. They endured. And then they accepted. In hindsight, the Death Guard's fate was not a betrayal. It was a fulfillment. They had always believed that strength came through suffering. Nurgle simply showed them what that belief truly meant, and they, being who they were, could not look away. There are moments in history that are not marked by thunderclaps or great speeches, but by the quiet unraveling of everything. Isstvan was such a moment. It began with a lie, a call to unity, to purge treachery from within. Loyalists were summoned under the banner of trust, ordered to strike down their own who had turned from the light. But the truth was darker. The Death Guard, alongside the sons of Horus, World Eaters, and Emperor's children, had already chosen their side. And so, at Isstvan III, they became executioners, not of enemies, but of brothers. The Death Guard's betrayal was clinical. They deployed their own loyalists to the surface of the planet, under the guise of rooting out rebellion, and then unleashed viral bombardment. The skies turned green, choked with the deathly mist of life-eater toxins. Cities melted, skies wept filth. It wasn't just extermination, it was an obliteration of memory. Entire legions of brave men and women were swallowed in an instant, not for victory, but for convenience. And all the while Mortarion watched in silence. He did not speak of honor. He did not explain. Because in his heart, he believed that this was just another form of necessary suffering. But it did not end there. Istvan was worse. A slaughter not just of trust, but of hope. The loyalist legions who had survived the first betrayal were now reinforced, believing they could still stop the tide. The Death Guard landed again, now openly aligned with Horus, and what followed was carnage. The drop site massacre was not war, it was a culling. Tactical superiority, combined with shock and sheer numbers, turned the battlefield into a tomb. The Death Guard advanced through trenches, slick with blood and ash, their bolters barking death, their ranks unshaken by what they had become. It was here that the Death Guard truly stopped being Astartes of the Imperium. They weren't just traitors now, they were transformed by choice. The battlefields of Isstvan revealed their new creed, one not of mercy or loyalty, but of finality. There was no going back. The lines had been drawn not in politics, but in bone and mud. And those who once marched beside them now fell beneath their blades, not because they were weak, but because they still believed. Among the Death Guard themselves, there was little hesitation. Perhaps that is what makes their betrayal so chilling. They did not argue. They did not waver. They obeyed Mortarion's will with the same grim resolve they had once reserved for the Emperor. In this, they revealed their deepest flaw: obedience without introspection. They were always tools, first of Terra, now of something far worse. And for those few among them who hesitated, who remembered what it meant to be a warrior of the Imperium, there was no room for dissent. The traitor legions did not tolerate indecision. And the Death Guard, perhaps more than any other, understood what happened to those who failed to keep up. They had trained their bodies to survive anything. Now they trained their souls to survive betrayal. Yet beneath the surface, Isstvan scarred them. Not all wounds are visible. The slaughter of brothers, the incineration of kin, the deliberate act of turning bolter against friend, these are things that leave marks deeper than flesh. Some Death Guard began to rot not from plague, but from guilt. It festered in quiet moments, in the long silences between deployments, in the stink of burned cities. For a legion so steeped in endurance, this was a new kind of poison, one that could not be purged through discipline. Mortarion never spoke of it. He pressed forward, deeper into rebellion, deeper into alliance with Horus, deeper into the abyss, and his sons followed, because that was who they were. Soldiers who did not question, who did not break. And Nurgle watched. He watched the deaths, he watched the silence, he watched the guilt that had no voice, the horror that had no outlet. And he waited. The Death Guard had proven their capacity for cruelty. Now they would be tested for something more dangerous: submission. Because the final betrayal was not of the Imperium or of their brothers, it was of themselves. Istvan was not a battle, it was a ritual, a slow, spiraling descent into the inevitable. And for the Death Guard, it marked the point where the path home was forever sealed. They were no longer warriors fighting for a cause, they were dead men walking, and the plague had already begun. They say time dies in the warp, that the hours unravel and the days bleed into centuries of madness. But for the Death Guard, their long walk through that hell was not timeless. It was infinite. Trapped in the Immaterium during their voyage to Terra, the Death Guard suffered a fate more intimate and grotesque than any battle. Their ships became tombs. Their bodies betrayed them. Their Primarch could do nothing. And that was the moment it happened, not with a scream, but with a cough. The warp storm that enveloped the Death Guard fleet was no ordinary storm. It was a churning, infectious tide, a spiritual contagion that didn't just corrupt flesh, but unstitched the soul. Their navigators lost control, their engines failed, systems collapsed, time twisted, and then the sickness began. At first it was subtle, fevers, tremors, strange smells in the recycled air, but it escalated with appalling speed. Marines who had once withstood radiation and toxins fell to vomiting blood, their enhanced organs no longer able to process the sheer virulence coursing through them. Skin bubbled, armor cracked. The plague had no name, but it spread like fire through oil. No apothecary could cure it, no resistance mattered. For the first time, the unbreakable legion was breaking. Inside the ships, horror reigned. The corridors filled with screams, not of fear but of rot. Marines coughed up their lungs, yet still lived. Flesh sloughed from bone, yet still they walked. The dead did not stay dead. Something in the plague made a mockery of death itself. Bolter fire ceased to matter. Faith meant nothing. There was only the smell, sweet, cloying, putrid, and the laughter. Not their own, but something distant, warm, welcoming. The sound of something ancient, delighted at their suffering. Mortarion was silent, always silent. His psychic abhorrence, his refusal to embrace sorcery, left him powerless against what was happening. He could not fight the plague, could not command it. He was reduced to watching his sons die in 1,000 grotesque ways, while knowing, in his core, that it was his pride that had brought them here. He had rejected the Emperor's light. But now, what remained? And that's when Nurgle came. He did not arrive with chains or demands. He came as relief, as acceptance. In the heart of every rotting Astartes, he whispered not promises, but comfort. "You are already mine," he seemed to say. "Why suffer needlessly?" And one by one, the Death Guard broke. Not in body, they had already broken there, but in spirit. They stopped resisting. They stopped fearing. They let the rot in, and found in it a twisted kind of peace. Mortarion was the last to fall. He tried to resist, not out of strength, but out of spite. He hated Nurgle, hated the idea of submission to something so putrid, so base. But in that hatred was exhaustion. He had fought his whole life, against the poisons of Barbarous, against the lies of the Emperor, against the horrors of the warp. He had always been strong, always endured. But now his sons were dying, screaming his name, not in reverence, in agony. And so he fell. Not with a curse, not with a prayer, but with a breath. A breath that no longer hurt. A breath that did not burn his lungs. He exhaled and let Nurgle in. The transformation was not instant. It was slow, viscous, grotesque. But it was also, in a terrible way, beautiful. The Death Guard did not die. They became. Their bodies bloated, but no longer decayed. Their pain receded, replaced by an eerie calm. Their armor fused with their flesh, swollen with tumors and gifts. They laughed, truly laughed for the first time in decades. Not because they were joyful, but because they had stopped being afraid. And thus was the Legion reborn, not as servants, but as chosen. Not as monsters, but as manifestations of inevitability. The long walk through the warp had been their crucible, their trial by plague. And what emerged was something more than Astartes, more than warriors. They became the disease made manifest, the final breath of every dying world. That walk through the warp was the moment the Death Guard truly became the Plague Marines. Not in name, not in armor, but in soul. They were no longer men, no longer sons. They were Nurgle's patience, his joy, his rot. And when they finally emerged from that rotting dimension, it was not as survivors. it was as a plague. The Death Guard who stepped from the warp were not the same legion that had entered. Their transformation was not simply a matter of mutation, it was a rebirth, a grotesque parody of ascension. Their armor was no longer armor, but a second skin of rust and fungus. Their flesh pulsed with unnatural life, split open in places to reveal tentacles, teeth, or the wheezing mouths of demon flies. And yet, they did not scream, they did not rage. They marched in silence or in laughter, and both were equally terrifying. They had become what Nurgle had always seen in them, the perfect hosts. To outsiders, they were an abomination. But to themselves, the change was not horror, it was clarity. They no longer feared pain, for pain had been their teacher. They no longer feared death, for death had become their medium. Disease was no longer a weapon, but a language. Every lesion, every pus-filled boil, was a word in the tongue of their god. They were now expressions of entropy, living vectors of collapse. But beneath the oozing filth was a twisted pride. They had endured what no other legion could. They had faced the warp, not with sorcery or piety, but with endurance. And that endurance had been rewarded. Not with beauty, not with glory, but with certainty. They would never again know fear, never again feel weakness. They were immortal, not in the pristine sense, but in the most fundamental one. They could not be unmade because they had already accepted unmaking. Each Death Guard Marine bore his own symptoms. No two were exactly alike. One might leak clouds of plague spores from ruptures in his back, spreading disease with every footfall. Another might carry an infestation of warpworms beneath his skin, their movements bulging through his armor like veins of sentient corruption. Their bolters, too, were infected, swollen and pitted with corrosion, yet they functioned with stubborn reliability. Each shot carrying not just explosive death, but viral payloads of spiritual infection. And through it all, the bells rang. Low, sonorous, endless. The bells of Nurgle's domain tolled through the immaterium and echoed in the souls of the Death Guard. It was a sound not of alarm, but of welcome. A reminder that they were part of something larger, an ecosystem of rot and rebirth, where decay was not the end, but the beginning of something new. Mortarion, now ascended to a Daemon Primarch, returned to his sons not as a general, but as a prophet of ruin. His wings of grave dust and miasma spread across the void like the wings of a dying angel. He did not inspire them with words. He simply existed, as the proof that their path was valid, that submission had birthed something stronger than pride. He was a symbol of inevitability, of final surrender. Under his guidance, the Death Guard refined their new role in the galaxy. They were no longer conquerors in the traditional sense. They did not care for control or strategy. They invaded worlds not to rule them, but to infect them, to change them. A Death Guard invasion was slow and methodical, like gangrene. First came the fevered dreams, then the coughing, then the death, and then something worse, the rebirth of the planet in Nurgle's image. Civilizations were not wiped out, but made to fester. Entire hives turned into gardens of rot, where life and death merged into one vile continuum. Even their demonic allies mirrored their philosophy. Where other legions summoned wrathful beings of fire and hatred, the Death Guard called forth Nurglings, great unclean ones, and plague daemons that oozed affection as much as violence. There was joy in their corruption, a familial warmth that made their evil even more perverse. Nurgle loved his children, and his children loved him. That love became their armor. Blades that should have severed limbs instead lodged in bloated flesh. Last blasts that should have vaporized targets were absorbed into swollen tumors. And even when a Death Guard was finally laid low, his corpse often twitched and rose again, held together not by biology, but by faith. Faith in decay, in rot, in Nurgle. Yet for all their grotesquerie, there was something profoundly tragic about them. They had once been men who sought strength through hardship, who wore their endurance like a badge. They had been betrayed by hope, by ideals, by a dream that asked for everything and offered nothing in return. Nurgle had not seduced them. He had listened, and in listening, he gave them what they had always craved. Not salvation, but a place where suffering was not failure. The Death Guard's rebirth was not a corruption of what they had been. It was the culmination, the natural endpoint of a philosophy that began with survival and ended in surrender. They were now icons of the great unclean one, carriers of a truth the Imperium refused to see, that death is not the enemy. It is merely the beginning of another cycle, and the Death Guard would walk that cycle forever. To understand the soul of the Death Guard after their transformation is to enter a paradox. They are monsters, yes, but monsters with meaning. Unlike the blood-frenzied berserkers of the World Eaters or the hedonistic zealots of the Emperor's Children, the Death Guard do not pursue chaos for thrill or excess. Their devotion to Nurgle is not rooted in ecstasy, but in ideology. They believe that rot is revelation, that decay is not just natural, but necessary. In a galaxy that fears change and worships permanence, they are the heretical prophets of transformation through entropy. They see the Imperium as a denial, a stubborn resistance against the truth that all things must break down. The walls of stone, the golden spires of Terra, the armor of Astartes, even the soul of the Emperor himself, they see it all as temporary delusions. And the Death Guard exists to puncture those delusions, to remind the universe that stasis is a lie, that no empire lasts forever, that even gods must decay. This belief is not casual, it is woven into everything they do. Their warships are rotting hulks, drifting through space like tumors detached from some primordial beast. Their fortresses are overrun with moss and bile, their banners soaked in mold and filth. They do not build, they infect. And yet, they do not see this as destruction. To them, it is the highest form of renewal. From death comes life, from ruin comes truth. Their battle doctrines reflect this. A Death Guard assault is never swift. They do not strike like lightning. They seep, they choke, they grind. They spread airborne pathogens through atmosphere processors. They poison water supplies with engineered bacteria that cause hallucinations, despair, and skin that weeps acid. Civilians are not collateral. They are part of the ritual. Every cough, every shriek, every body that slumps to the floor in a puddle of phlegm, these are hymns to Nurgle. And yet, in this filth, there is order. The Death Guard do not war with chaos in their hearts. Their ranks are disciplined, their command structure intact. Captains and plague champions lead with tactical clarity. Mortarian's will is followed without question. There is hierarchy. There is cohesion. They are not lost to madness. They are sharpened by it. This is perhaps their most disturbing quality, that they are not rabid beasts, but thinking, feeling, calculating warriors who have chosen to embrace rot as salvation. They debate philosophy in between battles. They discuss the artistry of infection. Some even keep journals, scratched into flesh, etched into rusted metal, tracking the evolution of their favored plagues. To them, war is not a slaughter, it is an act of gardening. And in this twisted worldview, they find strength. Because no matter what the Imperium throws at them, from the flaming wrath of the salamanders to the psychic might of the Grey Knights, the Death Guard do not falter. They do not retreat. They advance, step by step, across poisoned soil, immune to pain, immune to fear. And even when they fall, they often rise again, their wounds birthing new horrors. This concept of resilience, twisted though it is, defines them more than anything. It is their gospel. They preach it with every gasping breath. Every time a planet burns and the survivors collapse into their own waste, the Death Guard stand as proof that resistance is futile. Not because they are stronger, but because they endure longer. Their worship of Nurgle is not a cry for power. It is a declaration of truth. They do not beg for blessings. They are the blessings. They are the cough at the edge of sleep, the sore that never heals, the reminder that all things pass. And they wear this role with pride, a pride that is quieter than glory, but more enduring than honor. There is no repentance in them, no remorse, but there is memory. Deep in their souls, beneath layers of filth and corruption, they remember Terra. They remember being loyal. They remember being human. And that memory doesn't shame them. It validates their path. They chose Nurgle not because they forgot who they were, but because they realized who they had always been. This is why the Death Guard are not merely villains. They are mirrors. They reflect the cost of strength without joy, duty without love, survival without hope. And in that reflection, we see a terrible wisdom. Because they are not wrong, everything does rot. And in the end, we all breathe our last. Across the millennia of the Long War, the Death Guard have proven not just their loyalty to Nurgle, but the horrifying endurance of their purpose. While other traitor legions fell to infighting, fragmentation, and madness, the Death Guard remained unified, resolute in their mission. They do not care for dominion or political maneuvering. Their war is not one of conquest, it is one of saturation. Every campaign is another wound in the galaxy's flesh. Every system they touch festers, spreads, and collapses under the weight of spiritual gangrene. From the Eye of Terror, they emerge in slow, dreadful waves. Their fleets, if they can still be called that, are more like floating graveyards, plague hulks and contagion barges, bloated with warp rot and crawling with nurglings. Where the Black Legion charges with fury and the Night Lords strike from shadow, the Death Guard simply arrive. And then they don't leave. Their occupation is not measured in months or years, but in the smell of putrefaction that never fades, in the children born with 3 lungs and eyeless faces, in the ground that never again bears clean fruit. They have mastered the art of planetary attrition. It starts with subtle infections, sleeper cults who worship Father Nurgle in sewers and disease wards. Then come the plagues, slow, patient, tailored to the ecology of the target world. Nurgle's gifts are not hurled recklessly. They are curated like symphonies of decay, and only once the population is coughing blood and the PDF forces are begging for reinforcements, do the Death Guard land in force. When they do, it is not for dramatic effect. Their warships crack the sky open with plague meteors, vomiting filth into atmosphere processors. Spores the size of tanks rain from orbit. Demonic storms follow, and then the boots hit the ground. Plague Marines, droning engines of death, advance behind walls of toxin and blight. They carry bells, sensors, rusted bolters that wheeze like diseased lungs with every shot. They do not run. They do not hide. They walk forward through artillery and laser fire like statues of rot. Their battle strategy is as unchanging as it is effective. Endure. Where others maneuver, they absorb. Where others flank, they infest. Their numbers are bolstered by the relentless churn of the sevenfold path. Blightspawn, foul Blightlords, and demon engines that ooze across the battlefield like tumors on legs. The death toll mounts not through overwhelming force, but through inevitability. Every soldier who breathes in the tainted air becomes a liability. Every corpse is a potential vector. Even victory becomes contaminated. The Death Guard do not limit their attacks to Imperium-held worlds. They strike Xenos too, Tau colonies reduced to plague pits, Eldar craft worlds tainted by spiritual contagion, even orc infestations twisted into shambling green husks that chant the names of Nurgle between hacking coughs. Their mission transcends politics. Their hate is not selective. Everything must decay. And still, they endure. Within their ranks, there is an eerie stability. Captains and warlords rise through resilience, not ambition. They do not scheme like the Alpha Legion, nor tear themselves apart like the Word-bearers. Their hierarchy is rooted in strength proven through rot. The more you suffer, the more you are respected. The most bloated, the most pox-ridden, the most serenely accepting of Nurgle's will, these are the ones who command. Their titles are not honors, they are afflictions. Mortarion, from his festering fortress in the warp, guides them with a silent hand. His visions come in the form of pestilent winds, dreams of bile-stained victories, the rustling of dead leaves in empty corridors. His sons do not need fiery speeches. They feel his will in their bones, in their swollen organs. It guides them like gravity. And the galaxy, despite its fury, has failed to stop them. The Inquisition has purged billions, but the spores remain. The Mechanicus has sterilized entire systems, but the smell lingers. Even Gilliman's Indomitus Crusade could not uproot the contagion entirely. The Death Guard don't need to win, they just need to persist. Because in the end, that is their greatest weapon. Not power, not cunning, but the simple fact that they are still here, still walking, still rotting, still spreading. They are the long sickness, the fever that never breaks, the whisper in the cough of a child, the smell in a forgotten corridor. They are what happens when the universe stops pretending that it can be saved, and they will never be cured. He towers above the ruins of hope, a wraith cloaked in rot and regret. Mortarion, Daemon Primarch of the Death Guard, is not just a corrupted being, he is a paradox, a creature of conviction twisted by contradiction. Even now, 10,000 years after his fall, his presence inspires more than fear. It inspires a kind of sick pity. Because Mortarion did not fall because he was weak. He fell because he believed. And belief, when betrayed, becomes the most potent poison of all. As a Daemon Primarch, Mortarion has transcended the limits of flesh and reason. He is a being of mythic proportions, his wings made of smog and bone, his scythe a continent-cleaving arc of pestilence. But none of that power brings him peace. He does not laugh like Fulgrim, nor revel like Angron. He does not preach like Lorgar. Mortarion broods. He flies through his plague world of Barbarous Reborn, silent and grim, breathing in the stench of victory and finding it hollow. The most haunting thing about Mortarion is that, despite his godhood, he has never stopped hating the thing he has become. His loathing for Psykers and the Warp remains, even as he channels its power. He calls upon the gifts of Nurgle, but spits at the excesses of daemons. His palace is not a cathedral of joy, but a mausoleum of decay. Even his ascension was not celebration, it was surrender. Nurgle did not raise him in triumph, but in inevitability. And yet, he leads. Mortarion's leadership over the Death Guard is not one of love, nor even loyalty. It is one of reflection. His sons are broken as he is broken. They suffer as he suffers. In them he sees himself, and in himself he sees failure. But that failure has become a creed. They follow him because he never pretends, because he does not lie, because Mortarion, for all his bitterness, is honest. His hatred for the Emperor has not cooled. If anything, it has deepened, calcified into something ancient and cold. He sees the Emperor as the greatest hypocrite the galaxy has ever known, a being who preached unity but practiced domination, who reviled sorcery but wielded psychic might, who claimed to offer salvation but demanded obedience at any cost. Mortarion hates him, not only because he was denied his final kill on Barbarous, but because he believes the Emperor represents the lie of clean strength, the illusion that victory can be won without consequence. In contrast, Mortarion has embraced the cost. He does not hide his decay. He wears it. He forces the galaxy to look at him and see the price of survival. In every swollen blister, every weeping wound, he carries the proof that purity is a myth, that power is always bought in blood and bile. His body is a canvas of corruption, but his mind is still sharp, calculating, driven by purpose. And that purpose is spreading. Through the Plague Wars, Mortarion has sought not merely to destroy the Imperium, but to infect its soul. When he invaded Ultramar, it was not just a military campaign, it was a philosophical strike. To defile the realm of Guilliman, the favored son, the last hope of order, was to make a statement that even the purest light can be dimmed, that rot reaches everything, that the ideals of the Imperium are not immortal, they are fragile and rotting from within. His battles with Guilliman are more than personal, they are mythic, symbolic, echoes of a conflict that began not with swords, but with choices. Guilliman stands for order, logic, structure. Mortarion for entropy, rejection, the refusal to be defined by another's system. When they clash, it is not just a duel of Primarchs, it is a war of visions, and Mortarion, in his cruel, quiet way, believes he has already won, because he has nothing left to lose. And yet, even in his victories, there is no triumph, no celebration. Mortarion is not fulfilled, because deep down, beneath the demon hood, beneath the power, there is still that child gasping in the toxic air of Barbarous. Still that boy who wanted to kill his father with his own hands. Still that general who wanted to save his sons from magic and tyranny, only to doom them to something worse. Nurgle may hold his soul, but Mortarion has never truly belonged to anyone. Not the Emperor, not Chaos, not even himself. He is a prisoner of his own ideology, a warden of decay, a leader who leads not because he wants to, but because no one else will. And that is what makes him terrifying, because Mortarion does not need to be happy, he only needs to endure. When the Plague Wars began, it was not with a single strike or declaration. It began with a cough, in the lungs of a hive-world child, in the bowels of an agri-ship that had never seen battle, and from there, it spread. The Death Guard did not arrive as conquerors, they arrived as symptoms, an affliction in the body of the Imperium. And by the time Roboute Guilliman realized the scale of the infection, it had already reached the heart of Ultramar. These wars were unlike anything the Imperium had faced. This was not a traditional invasion. It was a metaphysical rot. The Death Guard's objectives were not strategic in the classical sense. They didn't seek to destroy infrastructure or seize control. They sought to contaminate, to erode not just flesh and soil, but morale, identity, and spirit. Guilliman's empire, his rebuilt beacon of hope in a galaxy gone mad, became the stage for Nurgle's play. The first act was subtle. Plagues tailored to each world's biosphere, engineered by Blightspawn in rusted labs, launched in canisters or whispered through cultist lips. Water supplies turned viscous. Crops grew with tumors. Birth rates soared. So did deformities. The medical clergy couldn't keep up. Faith alone was no shield. And when the worlds finally cried out for help, the Death Guard came, not as invaders, but as midwives of entropy. Each battle in the Plague Wars followed the same structure. Contamination, desperation, collapse. Imperial forces were suffocated by the pace and unpredictability of the outbreaks. Their traditional tactics, drop assaults, mechanized pushes, psychic scrying, meant little against enemies who could not be outmaneuvered, who cared nothing for terrain, who advanced through ruin like time itself. Poxwalkers overwhelmed trenches like living mudslides. Mephitic blight haulers, belching disease like exhaust, carved paths through armor columns. Flooded bloat drones hovered like flies over carcass-ridden cities, their sonic wails a hymn of despair. Each battle became not a clash of warriors, but a slow drowning, an attrition of sanity. And then came Mortarion. He did not strike immediately. He watched, hovered above infected atmospheres, his wings trailing plague spores across the stars. His arrival was a turning point, not just in war, but in morale. Even the Ultramarines, paragons of discipline, wavered in his presence. His aura brought not just disease, but the memory of failure. The bitter taste of betrayal that Guilliman had long tried to forget. Their eventual clash was monumental, Primarch against Primarch, history rewriting itself in every blow. Guilliman, luminous and logical, clad in the Emperor's armor. Mortarion, a silhouette of sickness, a wraith of what could have been. Their duel was more than physical, it was ideological. Guilliman fought for rebirth, for unity, for reason. Mortarion fought for acceptance, of chaos, of decay, of the futility of order. And yet, the Death Guard did not win the war. Not entirely. Thanks to the intervention of Saint Celestine, Grey Knights, and the warp-twisting sacrifice of Call's technology and Guilliman's genius, the tide was stemmed. The Plague Wars did not end in Imperium's collapse, but neither did they end in purity. Victory, if it could be called that, came at a cost. Entire sectors of Ultramar remain permanently tainted. Some worlds can never be reclaimed. In the void, rusted contagion ships drift, waiting. And the people remember, not just the battles, but the silence, the fear of breathing, the slow realization that death does not always come with a scream, but with a sigh. The Death Guard did not lose, because for them, victory was never measured in banners or worlds. It was measured in infection rates, in despair ratios, in the lingering scars they left behind. Every survivor who coughs, every child born with too many eyes, every chapel that smells just slightly of rot, these are their trophies. And Mortarion? He vanished back into the warp, not in retreat, but in patience. He had tested his brother, had seen the cracks, had infected hope itself. The Plague Wars were not his grand play. They were his introduction. The galaxy now knows what it means to rot. There is a certain poetry in decay, a stillness that speaks louder than fanfare, a message whispered through the crumbling of walls, the soft collapse of structure. The Death Guard are not just warriors of rot, they are its archivists, its evangelists. In the vast tapestry of Warhammer's grim darkness, they are the smear of mold that will never be scrubbed out. Their legacy, however cursed, is unforgettable, and the galaxy they have infected will never be clean again. What they leave behind is more than disease. It's a philosophy, one that has wormed its way into the nightmares of planets and the doctrines of the Imperium alike. Every spore-covered corpse, every blight-ridden battlefield, every tortured survivor bearing the gifts of Nurgle, it all speaks to a truth the Imperium desperately denies, that no matter how strong its walls, how sacred its faith, everything falls apart eventually. The aesthetic legacy of the Death Guard is as distinct as their doctrine. Their iconography, 3 circles forming a fly's face, rusted iron, swollen bellies bursting with life and death, has become an archetype of chaos itself. Entire chaos cults, even those not directly aligned with Nurgle, steal from their symbolism. Their grotesqueness has transcended allegiance. Their imagery evokes something primal, something that even those untainted by the warp can recognize in their bones. And there's something chilling about how recognizable they have become. The Death Guard are not obscure. They are iconic. Even the most purified shrines of the Adeptus Sororitas know their name. Even the Xenos races, disconnected from imperial history, have whispered myths of the plague bearers and their bloated lord. In the very dreams of astropaths, the Death Guard march across skies of blood, heralding the end not with fire, but with fever. Their psychic legacy is especially haunting. Worlds touched by their presence often remain psychically tainted for centuries, tides of despair and numbness lingering like spiritual fallout. Even long after the Death Guard are gone, their weight remains. It crushes faith. It breeds apathy. It whispers, over and over, that all struggle is wasted. Among the other traitor legions, the Death Guard command a strange kind of respect, not because of their power, but because of their permanence. The World Eaters rage and burn out. The Thousand Sons are cursed by their own ambition. The Black Legion splinters and reforms. But the Death Guard, they persist. They never needed to reinvent themselves. They found their truth early, and they have never strayed. Their sons, the newer Plague Marines, born from the fetid cauldrons of the warp, continue the legacy without doubt. There are no civil wars among them, no inner purges. A plague champion knows his path. A foetid bloat drone never questions its purpose. There is a serenity to their horror, a unity rare even among the forces of chaos. And what of humanity's memory? What is the legacy of the Death Guard in the heart of the Imperium? It is a warning, a rot-colored stain on every map, a reminder that resilience without introspection is a lie, that endurance can become pride, and pride, left to fester, becomes damnation. In this way, the Death Guard are not just the galaxy's rot, they are its mirror. They show us what happens when strength is worshipped above all else, when suffering is mistaken for nobility, when we stop asking why we fight and focus only on how long we can survive. They are the end result of loyalty stripped of love, of courage poisoned by silence. And that is why they remain so terrifying. Because in the Death Guard we see the darkest potential of what humanity can become, not through ambition or hatred, but through the simple refusal to change, through the comfort of the known, through the slow, quiet rot of the soul. And they will never stop reminding us, with every step, with every breath, with every cough. They are the sons of rust, and rust never sleeps. Some stories end with fire, others with silence. The tale of the Death Guard ends with a breath, a long rattling exhale of disease, grief, and tragic inevitability. They began as survivors, forged in the crucible of a poisoned world, unbreakable in flesh and spirit. They were not evil. They were not glory hounds. They were dutiful, loyal, and grim. And that is what makes their fall all the more horrifying, because they did not fall by lust or madness. They fell by endurance. The Death Guard were the first legion to truly become plague, not just in form but in philosophy. They accepted what others rejected. They embraced that which all mortals fear, rot, disease, impermanence, and they turned it into gospel. A slow, patient gospel written in bile and blood across 10,000 years of war. Their tragedy is that they found freedom in filth. They rejected the hypocrisy of the emperor, the illusions of purity, the tyranny of light. But in doing so, they chained themselves to something far worse. To a God who offers no choice, only gifts you cannot return. To a path that promises comfort but demands decay. They are free only in the way corpses are free. Motionless beyond pain, but dead all the same. And yet, they persist. Mortarion still soars, still festers, still broods in silence. His sons still walk the stars, spreading their gospel one spore at a time. No cathedral can keep them out. No fortress is immune. No planet truly cleansed, because the Death Guard are not just warriors anymore. They are entropy. They are the stillness at the end of the breath, the last sound before silence. They matter because they are honest, because they reflect the part of us that knows the truth. Everything ends, everything fades, everything rots, and from that rot they rise. There is a silence after slaughter that no chant can fill. No praise from Nurgle, no croaking cheer from Nurglings, no wet slap of demonic celebration can quite reach it. It is the moment when a world stops resisting, when its air is unbreathable, its cities collapse under the weight of their own sickness, and its people stop screaming. For the Death Guard, that silence is sacred. It is not the end of war, but its true music. And in the aftermath of the Plague Wars, that music played louder than ever before. Though Gilliman lived, though the Imperium repelled the infection from Ultramar's core, though the plague fleets were scattered back into the Eye and the Warp, The Death Guard had tasted something close to vindication, and it did not satisfy them. Not in the way it should have, not in the way they remembered. On the plague moons orbiting the warp-twisted shadow of Iax, where gardens of rot bloomed over broken basilicas and rivers of bile glimmered with unnatural life, the Plague Marines stood not as victors, but as priests awaiting further instruction. They wandered among the filth they had planted, not with pride, but with hunger for meaning. They gazed out across diseased fields and wondered why the ache in their bones still throbbed, why the gifts of Grandfather Nurgle still dripped without ever filling them, why the joy of destruction had begun to taste like ash. Many of them would never speak these thoughts. The Death Guard are not given to confession. Their pride lies in their silence, in their capacity to bear the unbearable. But even silence has a texture. Even stillness has a weight. And within their swollen bodies and bloated minds, the question began to fester. If they were the end, why did they feel unfinished? The younger among them, those born not in the Long War, but in the festering vats of the warp, shaped from the gene seed of rot and despair, could not understand it. They rejoiced. They feasted upon the memories of conquered planets, wore garlands of dried intestines, and grinned through faces half consumed by disease. To them, the silence was victory. The absence of resistance was proof that all would fall. They danced in the filth, and they laughed. But the veterans, the true sons of Barbarous, the ancient ones who remembered the bite of clean air and the sting of betrayal, felt something deeper, something hollow, something wrong. Mortarion felt it most of all. He stood alone atop his citadel on the plague planet, staring into the clouds of toxins that swirled endlessly across the sky. He had faced his brother, had nearly broken him, had watched the light in Guilliman's eyes dim beneath the weight of despair. And yet, it hadn't been enough. Not because his blow had been weak, but because Guilliman had refused to surrender, had endured. And that, more than anything, enraged Mortarion. Not in the way Angron raged, with howls and destruction. No, this was the cold rage of futility, the feeling of dragging your enemy into the filth, only to find they could still breathe. What does it mean to be a symbol of inevitability, Mortarion wondered, if the galaxy keeps resisting? He did not ask Nurgle. He knew the answer already. The Plague God does not promise swift dominion. He promises patience, cycles, the long, slow spread. For Nurgle, resistance is not failure. It is part of the design. Something to ferment, to soften, to warm beneath the skin until it bursts. But Mortarion had once been a man who demanded results, who killed tyrants, who measured victory in bodies and broken chains. Now he measured it in mold and memory, and neither filled the hollow. The Death Guard began to fracture, but not in loyalty, not in purpose, in identity. Some grew more demonic, shedding the last vestiges of reason and becoming little more than vessels for plague. Others clung to ritual, obsessively cataloging every infection, recording their blessings with the fastidiousness of surgeons turned mad. Some even began to pray, not to Nurgle, but to Mortarion, whispering his name in the dark as if seeking comfort from a father too distant to hear. There were whispers, rare, dangerous, of those who began to doubt, not openly, never aloud, but in the silence, in the long walks through rusted corridors between battles, in the way their bolters trembled not from rot but from hesitation. What were they really? Vectors? Weapons? Curses? Or were they something worse? Souls who had mistaken suffering for salvation? These doubts did not please Nurgle, but he did not punish them either. He welcomed them as he welcomed all things. Even doubt can decay after all. Even faith, once diseased, can spread. And so the Death Guard endured. They did not speak of the hollow feeling that followed the Plague Wars. They did not mourn the brothers they had lost to Guilliman's counter-offensives. They simply moved forward, into the next system, the next siege, the next breath. Because if they stopped, even for a moment, they might begin to remember what it felt like to want more. And for the Death Guard, memory is the most painful disease of all. The Death Guard do not always need to win a battle to win a war. This is the truth that terrifies inquisitors and planetary governors far more than the bloated silhouettes of plague marines on the horizon. For every world that survives their touch, every city that drives them back, every regiment that holds the line, there are traces left behind that can never be cleansed. Not in blood, not in fire, not even in prayer. Because the Death Guard's greatest weapon is not just disease. It is memory. The survivors are the proof. They walk with shrunken eyes and rattling lungs, their skin pale even under the brightest suns. They do not speak of the battles. They speak of the dreams. Dreams of a world that whispered to them in their sleep. Of a voice like the gurgle of water down a corpse's throat. A voice that did not demand, but invited. They remember how the plague came not with thunder, but with silence. A single man coughing in a marketplace. A child with greenish veins in her eyes. A priest who stopped preaching because he could no longer remember what hope sounded like. And then came the flowers. The pale growths in cracks between stones. The sweet, sick smell of honey and rot. The flies that didn't land but watched. Even after the Death Guard are driven away, these things remain. They remain in the gutters, in the backs of temples, in the wounds that won't heal, no matter how many salves are applied. They remain in the minds of those who saw too much. Soldiers who flinch at their own breath, Medicae who smell rot where there is none. Survivors tell themselves they are safe now, that the plague has passed. But when they dream of bells tolling in the mist, of a shadow walking the streets with a scythe that leaves no sound, of their own children smiling with too many teeth. And sometimes, quietly, they begin to believe. It is not quick, it is not overt. But over time, the survivors begin to keep strange idols, little figures carved from bone and wrapped in cloth. They start to leave offerings, not of food or coin, but of dead flowers, fingernail clippings, mucus cotton rags. They say it's just tradition, just something to ward off sickness, just something their ancestors did, surely. But it is not tradition, it is infection of the soul. The ecclesiarchy fights this, of course. They burn the idols. They execute the most devout of the plague wards as heretics. They declare day after day of penance, but they cannot erase what the Death Guard left behind. Because it is not a thing. It is a question. Why did I survive? And once that question takes root, it never leaves. Survivors begin to wonder if it was truly the Emperor who protected them or something else. Something older. Something that did not protect them out of love, but because it wanted them to endure, to carry a message. This is the genius of Nurgle's corruption. It wears the mask of kindness, of affection. Where Khorne screams, Nurgle hums. Where Slaanesh seduces, Nurgle comforts. He does not force the galaxy to love him. He simply waits until the galaxy is too tired to resist, until it begins to see his gifts not as horror, but as truth. Entire cultures shift this way, slowly, imperceptibly. On once pure worlds, new festivals arise to commemorate the passing fog or the day of the sweet breath. Medicae orders develop strange new rites for purifying instruments, rubbing them with fungus-infused oils or humming certain melodies that match the rhythm of bloated hearts. Children born after the plague walk with soft, squelching steps. Some never cry, only wheeze. And in the distance, always, a plague marine smiles. They do not need to return to these worlds. They already won. The infection has become cultural, spiritual, mythic. The Death Guard understand what the Imperium has always feared, that faith is not destroyed by force, it is undone by despair. The moment a man stops believing his God can save him, the rot begins. And the Death Guard have mastered the art of making men question. Not loudly, not violently, but in the breath between prayers, in the silence after a sermon, in the way the light falls strangely through cathedral glass, making a shadow that looks just a little too much like a fly's wing. There are entire sectors now where this rot has taken hold. The Administratum marks them as purged or reclaimed. But the Inquisitors know better. They file secret reports, hidden even from their peers, speaking of resurgence, of subterranean cults, of dreams infecting entire populations. The Death Guard do not need to return in force, just a whisper, a single spore. They are not just plague, they are persistence. The proof that the human spirit does not snap. It sags, it weakens, it accepts. In this way, the Death Guard wages second war, a war for meaning, for the narrative of survival. And more often than not, they win. Not with bolters, with memory. If you've followed this journey into darkness, if the weight of decay has gripped your soul like it grips the stars, then join us. Subscribe to this channel for more lore, more legends, more forgotten truths whispered beneath the screams of dying worlds, because the war never ends, and the plague always spreads.